everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Also consider joining my Patreon page for some cool perks. I'll leave a link in the description. I know what you need, some more rock and read. Today we'll read chapter 10 of White Line Fever by Lemmy. Chapter 10 is called It Was Me. Here we go. Of course, Motorhead didn't wind up on just any record label. Our manager Douglas Smith had convinced us that it would be best if we went with his company, GWR, an acronym for Great Western Road, where his offices were located. So our manager and record label were under the same roof. Plus, Doug and his wife were handling our merchandise too. Anyone could probably have told us that this was a very unhealthy situation, giving our management this much power, but no one did. So ignorant of business affairs as always, we forged ahead with the recording of Orgasmatron. Orgasmatron was our first full studio album in 3 years, and the lineup, except for me, was completely different from Another Perfect Day, but that didn't faze us any. Between the recording sessions for No Remorse and all the touring we did, the four of us were rather used to each other by then. We made the record in 11 days, which, as you might have figured by now, was no big deal for Motorhead. It was very easy, in fact, because the guys were so glad to be there. We gave our producer, Bill Laswell, a bit of a fright the first day, however. Me and Paul Hadwin, the fan club secretary at the time, had been drinking in this boozer when we saw an advert in the paper for Fatograms. We immediately thought, this is just the thing for Phil Campbell. So we booked one. Then we went into the studio with Bill Laswell and his engineer, Jason Corsero. They had just come over from the States, and they didn't know us at all. I'd met Bill for half an hour before this, and of course, nothing had been mentioned about Fatograms and such. So Bill and Jason were being all gung-ho American, let's get it on, boys, it's gonna be great, etc. But there was this large lady standing around the lobby. Phil later said he thought she was somebody's mother, and she came into the studio after us asking, which one's Phil? And Phil said, I am. Wham! She tore off her dress, and there she was, this huge woman in a little skimpy outfit with the tits cut out, singing Happy Birthday to You. I suppose it may not have been his birthday, but we told her it was, and she grabbed Phil and stuck his head between her tits. All we could see was just this little tuft of hair sticking out between them. Then she started slapping him with them, nearly knocked him out. It was great, and Laswell and Casero were edging behind the desk, going, what the is this? That was their introduction into the world of Motorhead. As it turned out, Bill was good for getting sounds, but he everything up in the mix. It was a much better album when he took it to New York than when he brought it back. A bunch of us, our people, as well as people, got together for the grand first time playing, and our publicist bought a case of champagne to ring in the occasion properly. It was dreadful. Orgasmatron was mud. There was supposed to be a 4-part harmony on Ain't My Crime, but he wiped 3 of them out. I won't bore you with the rest of the highlights. Suffice it to say that our publicist was edging the crate of champagne back under the desk with her foot, while Laswell's manager was standing by the door, bopping determinedly. It was hopeless. I tried to remix some of the record, but Bill and Jason weren't being particularly helpful because it was our mix and we liked it, and that's the way it was. And this difficult musician was coming over trying to teach us our own job. Well, I suppose I am difficult, if you consider wanting to get the job done right difficult. I didn't come up with the title Orgasmatron right off the bat. The album's working title was Riding with the Driver. Each Motorhead studio album except Bastards, which we made in 1993, is named after one of its songs. But that track didn't turn out as good as we'd hoped. I don't even know at the time that Orgasmatron was a contraption in some Woody Allen film. I never saw the movie, but I've been told about it quite often since. However, I made up the word on my own. A lot of our fans consider this album one of our classics, and there are some great songs on it. The title track, In Debt Forever, for example. I always had problems with the way it was mixed, though. As far as I'm concerned, it was only half the album it should have been. I do want to note, however, that there's a great picture of Lars Ulrich on the original album sleeve. He had come up to see us at the Beverly Sunset a couple years before while we were in Los Angeles, and he got a bit ill. He was still a youngster in those days, but it's a fallacy to say I taught him how to drink. I actually taught him how to throw up, and that's what he did, all over himself. That's what he got for trying to keep up with older people's habits. A photo of that classic moment in rock history appears on Orgasmatron. With a new album to promote, we were on the road again, and Douglas had to outdo himself once more with the stage setup, hence the Orgasmatron train, to go with the record's cover art. The drums went out on the front of the train, and it came out on rails in the middle of the stage. Basically, Pete was riding out to the front of the train, but it never worked. You couldn't get the rails on the stage properly, and things like that. Douglas did have some great ideas. The bomber rig was brilliant. But this one was a very botched job. That and the infernal iron fist. But the train came with us through most of Europe. Orgasmatron really should have brought us back up to speed. Our new record with the new lineup and all. But nobody bought it. Or I should say nobody was able to buy it. GWR farmed the album out to various distributors around the world, most of whom did a shoddy job of getting it into the stores. But we all played the usual places. Europe, the Castle Donington Festival, England, and the States. We started off the US tour with Megadeth opening up for us, but they were a very new band and they blew it. That first night in Oakland, they had their stage banner stretched out on the floor across our dressing room doorway. And since we're no respecters of tradition, we walked straight across it. The band's manager dashed in freaking out. "You walked on our banner!" And I said to him, "Look, there was no way of getting into our dressing room without walking on your banner. Why don't you put it some place else?" We were running late at soundcheck that night. It was the Kaiser Auditorium, I recall. The first show was always fraught. We had new guys in the crew, and people were still setting up and learning. And that manager stormed up to our sound man's desk just as he was finishing up the drums and said, "You guys have to get off the stage, now. It says in my contract that my band has a sound check now." Dave, our sound guy, turned around and stared at him. "I'm sorry?" He said. "Tell your guys to get off the stage," the idiot commanded. So Dave pulled out the copper's truncheon that he keeps behind the sound desk. "If you don't go away, I'm going to hit you very hard between the eyes with this." So the guy went away ranting and screaming backstage. Meanwhile, Megadeth's frontman Dave Mustaine came in to apologize and he crashed out in our room. Poor Dave was a bit out of it at the time. He's since cleaned up, and there was the manager stalking around outside, unaware that his star was possibly dying on our couch. But to be fair to the band, although we threw them off the tour the next day because of all the with the manager, it wasn't really their fault. It was the manager. We should have just thrown him off the tour, actually. Years later at the NAAM show, Dave Mustaine came up and apologized to me for it. That was really big of him because he didn't have to. We could have just gone on leading parallel lives and it would have been alright. More power to him. He's a smart man. Mustaine, he's got freckles, but he's a smart man. Overall, that wasn't our most stellar tour through the US. In New Orleans, the audience was spitting at me. Punks, you know, and I warned them that I would leave if they didn't stop. And they didn't stop, so I left. And there was a riot with fire hoses and all kinds of... Then in Aurora, Illinois, Graham, my roadie for years, smashed my favorite bass. It sounded great, and I played nothing else from the time I got it till he broke it. He didn't do it on purpose, but he came to me with the two ends of it hanging around his neck, laughing. It was still repairable after he broke it, but he took it into the parking lot and smashed it to smithereens in a fit of pike, so I fired him. During the short breaks in between all these various tours, I made all sorts of cameo appearances. I played an outlaw, typecasting, don't you think? In a video for this song, I Want to Be a Cowboy by the band Boys Don't Cry. I got up at Hawkwind's gig in the Reading Festival and sang Silver Machine. Then there was Boss Goodman's testimonial at Dingwalls. Boss was a roadie, then a manager for the Pink Fairies, and then he ran Dingwalls. He became one of those mover and shaker types. A nice guy, and he was having this testimonial because he was retiring, which in fact turned out to be true. I haven't seen him since. Anyhow, Wurzel and I played some numbers with Rat Scabies of the Damned and Mick Green from the Pirates. Larry Wallace was supposed to play with us as well, but he was also playing in 2 other bands that night, including our own Love Pirates of Doom, and he refused to come and rehearse with us. He was such a drag that Mick Green finally told him, "Look, Larry, we'll be alright, you know what I mean? Thanks anyway." We didn't need Larry anyhow. Mick's a great guitar player, and we did a good show. Also in the midst of all this, Motorhead did the inevitable BBC Peel Sessions recording, and I appeared briefly in a Doctor and the Medics video. Orgasmatron sales may have been disappointing, but our visibility factor was certainly high in 1986. Early in 87, I had a featured role in the film Eat the Rich, and Motorhead did the soundtrack, mostly songs from Orgasmatron, plus the title track. The movie was made by comic strip people, who were also responsible for the Young Ones TV show and a few other projects. One of their earlier shows, called Bad News, had been about a mythical heavy metal rock band, a bit like Spinal Tap, but better actually. And I'm one to know. Bad News, the band from the show, had opened for us at Donington, and we were all chatting at the gig. And eventually, Peter Richardson, who was the film's director, rang me up and asked me if I wanted to be in the movie. I got the part as simply as that. To be honest, I don't like making movies. I've been in several of them now. It's dead boring. They tell you to show up on the set at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then at 3 that afternoon they say they don't need you. So it's just waiting around all day. Basically with a bunch of actors. Eat the Rich wasn't so bad though. I spent a lot of time drinking with Nosher Powell, who had the lead role as the Home Secretary. He has a club now in South London frequented by villains and gangsters of all shapes and sizes. My character was called Spider, and I was supposed to be working for this Soviet double agent, Captain Fortune, played by Ronald Allen, who was in A Night to Remember, the Titanic movie from the 50s. I won't get into the plot of Eat the Rich here too much. It's a black comedy involving cannibalism in a smart restaurant with lots of political overtones. Quite a few people did cameos. Paul and Linda McCartney, Bill Wyman, Koo Stark, Angela Bowie. Not that she's any big deal. Her claim to fame is that she was married to David Bowie. It's a very English film, really. A lot of Americans don't get it, but I think it's quite good. My part didn't require any major sort of acting. I just played myself. I even used my own clothes. The director's instructions for me pretty much consisted of, walk over here and say this. If you happen to rent the video, look closely at the scene where I'm riding a motorcycle. It's not really me. They shot that when I was off touring America with Motorhead, and I had to leave a set of my clothes behind. They ended up having a girl double for me, a big girl. Good, eh, trivia fans? The director ended up having all of Motorhead in the film. We replaced the band in the ballroom scene. It was a secondary idea he had halfway through shooting. If you watch very closely during that scene, you'll notice that the band changes all the way through it. First, there's none of our mob in it. Then there's just me playing and the rest of the band are straight guys. Then Phil appears, then Wurzel and Phil Taylor appear. I had just fired Pete Gill that morning and Filthy shot down real quick in his car to do the scene. So much for continuity. The sacking of Pete Gill was a long time coming. Peter was his own worst enemy. He was another one who wouldn't just be content to be in the band. He went up against me on a couple of decisions, and he was making Phil and Wurzel upset too. I got tired of him moaning. So, when he kept us waiting while he hung around in the lobby of his hotel for 20 minutes while he read the paper or something, that was the proverbial last straw. I know it sounds trivial, but most flare-ups in families are, aren't they? And a band is a family. I let him stay for a couple more months, but it wasn't the same. I mean, enough's enough. I already knew Phil Taylor wanted to come back. He had been playing with Frankie Miller along with Brian Robertson, and it wasn't working out very well. One time Motorhead was flying home from a tour of the States, and Frankie Miller, Filthy, and Robbo were on the same plane. That was very weird to begin with, and then the three of them started fighting amongst themselves in mid-flight. Sometime after that, Phil came round and asked for his job back, but we told him, well, we gotta keep Pete at the moment, not yet knowing all the conniving that was to occur. I'm too honorable for my own good, Brian Downey from Thin Lizzy asked for the gig around the same time, and I turned him down. So the situation with Pete came to a head the day of the shoot. He took so long to do everything, and we were always having to wait for him. It was just getting up my nose, because, after all, I'm a speed freak, and I don't like waiting. That morning we got in the car and went down to the hotel to pick him and Phil Campbell up. Phil came bopping out of the hotel immediately, but Pete was still in his room, not dressed, and we sat there for half an hour while he around. Then he was saying goodbye to people in the lobby, and we were supposed to be at this shoot. Film people were sitting with their cameras on idle, so finally he came out, but I was fed up. I rolled down the car window and said, You're fired. And we drove off, and that was it. Last I heard about Pete, I believe he was touring with some alternative version of Saxon. It's got 3 original members of the band who had all been fired, so they were calling themselves Son of a... which was Saxon's original name. Anyhow, with Pete gone, we gave Phil Taylor his job back. It was a mistake in retrospect, but then everything is easy in retrospect, isn't it? This situation worked all right for a while, but things weren't the same, and I should have known they wouldn't be. But by June, we were back in the studio recording a new album, which would be Rock and Roll. Rock and Roll is a fair album, but it isn't one of our best. There were problems in the studio. Nothing truly disastrous, just a series of little annoyances. Our biggest mistake was choosing Guy Bidmead to produce it. He was an engineer really, so we were pretty much producing ourselves. Guy had looked like a good idea though. He had worked a bit with Vic Mail, who helped on our 2 most successful albums, and he had engineered the tracks we recorded for No Remorse, but the chemistry wasn't quite right. It wasn't Guy's fault, really. It was us, too. We were calling all the shots, and whoever was nearest the desk would generally be the loudest. There was quite a bit of confusion when we were making that album, and Wurzel was having a bad time personally. His old lady kept coming up to the studio and chasing him around, causing all manner of family arguments while we were supposed to be working. That certainly didn't help. A lot of times the way a record turns out depends on what the band members are going through while they're in the studio. If a guy's getting harassed at home or he's got some money problems or whatever, it affects his performance because his mind won't be on the job 100%. In addition to all of this, we didn't have enough time to do the songs properly, and when that happens, you're pretty much wasting your time. That said, we did have some amusing moments. One of the studios we used to make rock and roll was Redwood, which was co-owned by Michael Palin, and it turned out the engineer had worked on all the Monty Python records. He played us some great outtakes that Python never put out. We also asked Michael Palin to come down and do a recitation to put on the album. He showed up dressed in this perfect 1940s cricketer outfit, the striped blazer, the duck trousers, the white pumps, a V-neck sweater with his hair all brushed over to one side, a complete vision, and he walked in saying, "Hello, what sort of thing are we going to do now then?" I said, "Well, you know, in The Meaning of Life there was this speech that began, 'Oh, Lord.'" "Ah," he said, "give me some Cathedral," and he went in and did it. It was great. Even though we've done better records both before and since, rock and roll did have some great songs like Dogs and Boogeyman. We played Traitor for years, and Michael Palin's "Oh Lord" looked down upon these people from Motorhead speech at the end is classic, but overall, it just didn't seem to work. Still, it's not a bad album. I don't think we've made a bad one. Anyway, with the new record done, there was the usual promotional stuff. MTV Europe had an international Lemmy Day, which frankly, I remember nothing about. And of course, we spent the rest of the year touring through England and then Europe. We were supposed to begin 1988 by touring through the US with Alice Cooper, but we missed a month of it because the American Immigration Department took so long to give us our work permits. It was just a lot of bureaucratic bull. I mean, we bring foreign money to America and they don't give a about that. They'd rather give amnesty to all illegal immigrants. Actually, I missed out on that by 1 year. I had been living in America for 6 months when the amnesty was granted in 1991. If I had known it was coming, I could have stayed out beyond my work permit and then got amnesty and a green card. I can't get a green card because I got busted there for 2 sleeping pills in 1971, so obviously they have to watch out. Dangerous drug fiend, right? Brilliant thinking, that. Anyhow, the Alice Cooper tour, once we finally got on it, was a pain in the ass. It wasn't Alice's fault. He had no idea what we were being put through by his tour manager. That guy was a complete... He made everything really difficult for us. Since he was working for the top star, somebody else had to suffer and be made to look bad. We couldn't do this and we couldn't do that. Arrogant sons of... How important do they think they are? It's only a band, not the House of Parliament. Not that that's important either. Finally, this idiot took away our all-access passes and replaces them with passes where we could only go backstage up to when we played. So, after we finished our set, we couldn't get in. Naturally, I wouldn't stand for that kind of... So I walked around the crew and said, "Give me them passes," and gathered them all up. Then I walked straight into the production office, threw them down, and said, "There, look, we're out of here." I was leaving. Toby, Alice's accountant, who had a brain, came and spoke to us and gave us our passes back. Toby still works for Alice. The other guy doesn't. Need I say more? I talked to Alice years later, and he never knew any of this happened. That his people were doing things in his name that made him look like a hole. Something he definitely isn't. One thing, though. I've never understood his fixation with golf. I mean, what is the deal with that? You hit a ball with a stick and then you walk after it and you hit it again. I say if you hit it and then you find it, you got lucky, pal. Put it in your pocket and go home. Thanks, George. We had our own kinds of recreation. Phil Campbell pulled one of Alice's dancers. I never forgave him for that because she was so beautiful. Gail was a great girl, and we still see her when we go through Chicago. And an Alice Cooper show is always an impressive thing to watch. I'm a big Alice fan. On a less pleasant note, it took some effort to get to some of these venues. I remember going up to a gig at St. John's, Newfoundland. We had to load all our stuff on a ferry, and it was freezing. So cold that it bit straight through you, and there were icebergs in the water. In the middle of the night, we came out of the cabin to get something out of the bus, and I slid all the way across the deck to the railing and nearly went over into the sea. The story of the Titanic has fascinated me for years, well before the film and all the fuss. And the whole time I was thinking, this is what it was like when the Titanic went down, because we were at the same latitude. In fact, our next day was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is where they brought all the bodies. Imagine jumping into that water voluntarily. The shock when you hit it must have you up. So on the metal wall next to the rail where I'd landed, I wrote, "Remember and be thankful it wasn't you on the Titanic, 1912, 14th of April." We spent a good portion of 1988 out on the road. It had been our natural habitat for a long time, and it's still that way today. It's funny, the metabolism you need at tour is unlike anything else any doctor has come across, ever. Forget the Elephant Man. At least he was all in one piece and working in the same direction, deformed as he was. We are deformed. Not that much, just slightly deformed. Correct that. We're very deformed. The physical requirements for touring are unique. We're no good for anything else. You gotta get up on stage every night and suddenly be energetic within minutes. We've gone on stage in all kinds of conditions. Once in April of 1988 in Paris, Phil Campbell broke his ankle. He was fighting with Phil Taylor, and they fell under a table, and only one of them got up. He did the gigs we had scheduled after that in a cast. And I've already enlightened you on the various stages of Filthy's health, both physical and mental. We have missed a gig here and there because of injuries or illness, but those have been very, very rare occasions. I can't understand any other way of being alive than playing in a rock band all over the world. For 2 years, we were home for 1 month in each year. It was great fun, though. Kind of blurred, but fun. Occasionally, during the brief periods of time we spent at home, we'd attend some really stellar event. That spring, we saw the Rolling Stones play a surprise show at the 100 Club, an old jazz club at Oxford Street that turned to rock and blues. That was an extremely good evening. Everyone, Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton, and the like, showed up with their guitars and jammed. So, it obviously wasn't that much of a surprise. The real surprise was Wurzel. I think he was even a surprise to himself. We got to attend the after party at Keith's suite at the Savoy because a friend of ours, Simon Sessler, had an uncle who worked for Keith. But Wurzel had already begun his evening of terror at the 100 Club by knocking Bill Wyman flat on his back. He was flying down the stairs and Wyman just happened to be in his path. We managed to arrive at the party without any further mishaps, but there were more to come. For a while, we were sitting and talking with Simon when Kirsty McCall came by with her new husband, producer Steve Lillywhite. Kirsty was a great old friend of mine. I was in a video of hers once, so I gave her a big hug, and Wurzel turned to Steve Lillywhite and said, "Who's that old boiler the Lemmy's got a hold of?" Steve gave him this look and replied, "That's my wife, actually." "Ah," said Wurzel, "could I have some more coffee, please?" Then about a half hour later, he was standing by the bar next to Ronnie Wood. Joe Howard, Ron's stunning wife, walked past, and everything was moving. You know what I mean? And Wurzel leered. "Hey, I'd like to her, wouldn't you?" And Ron said, "I do, actually. She's my wife." Talk about putting your foot in your mouth. Wurzel had both feet in up to his knees. Luckily, it wasn't catching because I was standing around when I heard this voice behind me say, "Hello, Lemmy. I've always wanted to meet you." I turned around, and it was Eric Clapton. This was big news for me because I remembered him well from the Blues Breakers and the Yardbirds, so I managed to say hello without groveling. I mean, Eric. I also wrote some songs that year for people other than Motorhead. We were rehearsing in the same area as girls' school, and we all went to a pub, and I wrote Head Over Heels there for them. I scribbled it down on the back of a beer mat or something, and Kim took it away with her. I also wrote a song, Can't Catch Me, for Lita Ford's record, Lita, which turned out to be her most successful album. We were in LA at the time, and she came down to our hotel, the Park Sunset, and told me she needed songs. Once again, I wrote it right there and gave it to her. I wrote it as a 12-bar, but she didn't record it that way. I had known Lita since 1975 when she was in the Runaways. At their first gig in London, Joan Jett wore my bullet belt. I thought Lita was the best thing in the band. She had great tits and played mean guitar, but Joan looked meaner, probably because she was. Lita made a great solo record, but then I think she let the people around her have too much of a say in her career. For a start, she was too dressed up, and it looked like she was being pushed way too hard to try to be the next big thing. It just didn't work out for her. She was a real rock and roller, not this glossy chick they made her out to be. Then her mother died, and she was really devastated by that. Last time I saw her was a few years ago at a music convention in LA. We were on a panel together, but she was quite short. Just, "Hi, Lem," and a quick squeeze, then she was gone. She didn't hang around at all, which I thought was very strange. So, Miss Ford, give me a call. We'll talk. A lot of performers from the 80s haven't fared very well. That's obvious from watching The Decline of Western Civilization Part 2, The Metal Years. Where are all those people now? That film probably helped kill their careers. It made everyone who liked heavy metal look like morons. I was filmed for a segment of that, but I came off okay. No thanks to the director, Penelope Spheris. She took me up to Mulholland Boulevard in the Hollywood Hills, and the camera crew was about 20 yards away from me. Penelope had to shout her questions at me. I said, "Can you ask me questions from a bit closer?" "I don't want to be in the shot," she said. "You don't have to be in the shot." "Nah, I'm going to read them from here." Idiots. They could have come closer, used a different lens or something, but no. It was a stupid move anyhow. Everybody always says I'm the best thing in it, and I tell them the only reason I was good in it is because all the rest of them are so terrible. I've had to do a lot of strange appearances. I was interviewed on the radio by some TV psychiatrist. That guy used to reduce a lot of people to tears on his show. Room 13, I think it was called, but not me, as you might imagine. I was also on a program with the Joan Collins fan club, which was just one guy, Julian Clary, who's famous now under his own name. He was alright. Very and camply sarcastic, and I love that kind of humor. I think Julian's going to end up as a modern-day Noel Coward. But him and me together on a TV show certainly made an odd combination. A couple years ago, I, along with a lot of other heavy rock performers, did a video for Pat Boone because of the album he made covering metal tunes. This is not as weird as you might think. I thought he was an excellent performer in his day. Anyhow, back to my day, or with this particular period of time, you might call it dog days. In 1988, we also did another live record, No Sleep at All. We figured we might as well since we had this relatively new lineup and all. It was recorded at the Giants of Rock Festival in Hämeenlinna, Finland in July. but it was a mistake and failed miserably sales-wise. The record itself is alright. It could have been better, no doubt, but we had Guy bid me to mix it because we wanted to give him another try, mainly because he had been Vic Mail's boy, and Vic was a great live mixer. After that, I think we finally figured out that Guy just wasn't Vic Mail. Don't get me wrong, though. After all I've said about Guy, it was only because he was taking orders from us. He was too nice. Vic knew when to tell us to shut the up. Of course, we went on the road and toured behind No Sleep. Nothing new there. When we went through the States, we opened for Slayer. Tom Array is a really nice guy. Plus, he plays bass and sings as I do. But I'm not so sure about the band's philosophy of terror and gore. They don't realize what they're doing. Like, in the middle of their show, Tom would say something to the effect of, "Do you want to see blood?" One day I told him, "You don't want to be saying that, Tommy. Someday that's going to backfire on you." He insisted, "Oh, these are my people, man. I understand them and they understand me." Then the very next night in Austin, Texas, there he was. "Do you want to see blood?" And half a chair went past his head, missing him by about an inch. He lost it altogether. Got on the mic and gave the audience a sermon, waving his finger around and stomping up and down. He was beside himself with fury, and when he came off the stage, I was standing there going, "Uh-huh, your people, eh?" I enjoyed that tour quite a bit, actually. We took a short break at the beginning of 1989, during which Phil Campbell went off to Germany to do some tracks for some Swiss band called Drifter. Then, after we went through the UK, we headed to South America for the first time. We had never seen anything like Brazil. On one hand, you've got Copacabana Beach with bronze millionaires and their moles, and then 200 yards away there are people living in cardboard boxes amongst sewers running through the sand. You've got shopping malls with everything in them that you could possibly want, and next door, literally at the edge of the parking lot, is a shanty town with one wire running from the telegraph pole with a light bulb in each cardboard box. We saw a guy sleeping under a bridge with a table, a chair, a sofa, and a picture on the wall, 5 feet from the traffic. That's where he lived. Unfortunately, I see the U.S. heading in the same direction. Great Britain already seems like a third world nation, and judging from all the homeless people around, it looks like America isn't far behind. Can somebody tell me why the richest country in the world has people living on the streets? Anyhow, we played 4 dates in Brazil, 2 in Sao Paulo, and 1 each in Porto Alegre and Rio. The venue in Rio was underground, an incredibly hot concrete bunker. They weren't these massive stadiums that one had heard about, although we did play those when we came back. It wasn't that great a tour the first time we went, but it was amazing all the same. We went home with mountains of practically worthless currency. It was like Weimar Germany. Interesting place, but rather frightening, really. Another country we toured that year was Yugoslavia. That was where Phil Campbell made one of several attempts to quit Motorhead. For a while, it seemed like he was quitting every other day. I'm not sure what was really going on with him at the time. It seemed like he was having a nervous breakdown or something. Anyway, we were driving across Croatia in the mountains. It was in the middle of nowhere. All they got up there is sheep, goats, crags, and the odd shepherd. And it was the middle of the night, and Phil was having a row with somebody. I forget what the problem was, but he was storming up and down the bus, packing his bags and yelling, "Stop this bus!" The Yugoslav bus driver didn't care. He stopped the bus and boom! Opened the door. So Phil stepped out of the bus with 2 suitcases into 3 feet of snow. There was a blizzard howling horizontally as he looked around. On one side of him was a snowdrift, and down the valley miles away there was one light. It went out as he was looking at it. Great that was, a treasured moment in Motorhead history. Needless to say, Phil didn't quit the band that night. He did keep trying, though. We went on our way to Berlin, and he was doing it again. "I'm leaving the band." He came up behind the bus driver and said, "Take me to the airport." "This bus is going to the gig," I said. Phil wasn't about to let that stop him. "Well, I'm hiring the bus as well as you are, and I want to go to the airport." "This is paid for by the band," I replied, "and you are now a civilian. The band is going to the gig on the band's bus. So if you want to go to the airport, you get out and get a taxi, right? And you can ring one from the gig because you can't use the band's mobile phone anymore, okay? You're a civilian now, Phil. This bit of news was met by a lot of muttering under the breath, and again, he gave up the idea of leaving. He tried once more at the beginning of another German tour. He left the band the first night we got to Frankfurt before we'd even got started. Nothing would do, but he had to go to the airport, no matter that it was 11:30 and all the planes were gone. He went there anyway and slept in a chair. When he woke up, somebody had stolen all his bags. After that, I think he learned his lesson and stopped trying to quit the band. Phil is still with us today, and other than me, he's the longest running member of Motorhead. He's also a constant source of amusement. Many a times he's walked out of a gig into the back of the gear truck, thinking it was the bus. He got into a bass bin once, thought it was his bunk. No end of fun, Phil. He's sort of like our Keith Moon. Incidentally, he's also an excellent guitar player. But back to the Yugoslav dates. We had two. During the first one, Wurzel fell off the stage. One minute he was next to me, and the next he was gone, straight down. That wasn't the sturdiest stage that was ever built either. I remember walking into a hole near the back. On the second night, something happened that was potentially far more disastrous. During the first song before the solo, some hole threw a razor blade at the stage. The guy had even taped it between two coins to give it more thrust, and it cut my hand wide open. I didn't really feel it, so I didn't know what had happened until I began seeing all this red on the floor of the stage. Then I looked at my hand and realized it was gushing blood like a mother. But I wrapped a rag around it and we finished the show. It was a terrible wound though. When we came off stage, I took the rag off and blood spurted all over the walls amidst the cries of disgust from the rest of the band. So I went to this Yugoslav peasant's hospital and got stitches, but over the next 4 days, my arm slowly began to turn black, blood poisoning. We stopped in Nuremberg on the way home and I saw a doctor there, thinking German doctors were good, but this guy really hit up. I had been asking our manager Douglas to fly me home so I could get this mess taken care of, but he didn't want to pay for the plane fare. If it had been up to him, I would have had to take the bus all the way back to England. And when I say my arm was black, I don't mean blue. It was black with a bit of red. I almost lost my thumb and fingers. It was so bad that our tour manager finally said, this, and put me on a plane. I was in a hospital in England for 2 weeks with my arm hanging in a sling, all because of some little who thought it was smart to throw a razor blade at a band. In fact, I'll tell you exactly how smart that guy was. After he did it, he stood there pointing to himself saying, "It was me!" Naturally, our crew headed his way, rubbing their hands together. Oh, really? A live one. They kicked the out of him, and when they were done, the Yugoslav police kicked the out of him as well, and they are professionals. And believe it or not, he was still there at the loadout yelling, "Come on, man," and all that. A real die-hard idiot. I'll never understand that. I could see him hating me for some odd reason. I could see him premeditating the thing and doing it, but I can't see him going, "It was me," to my people. I wonder where that guy is now. Anyhow, the police loved me that night because I carried on playing. If I had stopped in front of those 6,000 people, there would have been a riot. There were a lot of riots going on back then. But anyhow, I was their hero for keeping the show going. That year at least. I don't suppose I am now after the double whammy we got hit with when we came back to play again. Phil Campbell and Phil Taylor both wound up in the hospital, and we had to cancel the show. I remember going up to Wurzel's hotel room. "Gig's off, Wurz," I said. "Why?" "Drummer, guitarist can't do it. They're in hospital." "Have they been run over?" Wurzel asked. "In a way, yeah. The both of them were flattened by some brown speed." "Well, it wasn't speed at all." "Brown speed?" I said to Phil Campbell. "Didn't you think?" And he said, "No." Phil Taylor, too. They both should have known better. "Speed ain't brown." But no, they wound up being carried past each other in the hospital corridor. What were they thinking? That was almost as stupid as the guy yelling, "It was me!" In June, our fan club had its 10-year anniversary and threw a party at the Hippodrome. I met Wendy there, Naughty Wendy from Red Car. I was walking around a corner at the theater and there was this bird with these fantastic eyes. She was just tremendous. I don't remember anything about the party after that. I was with Wendy. She was a great girl, very supportive of me in all sorts of ways. I saw her not too long ago when I was in England, and it was nice to see her again. I hadn't seen her for 8 or 9 years. Luckily, she hasn't changed into a drooling hag. Some of them do, you know. The Hippodrome was a big venue in London, as indeed it still is. It was famous for dancing bears in the 19th century, but by 1985, all they could get was us. I used to go up there on heavy metal night and try to hit on all these girls who came to see the good-looking bands. Well, you never know. I got more than I bargained for one night when I went up there and ended up on the stage with John Bon Jovi, Richie Sambora, and Dave Snake Sabo, Rachel Bowen, and Sebastian Bach from Skid Row. We did Creedence Clearwater's Traveling Band and Rock and Roll, the Zeppelin number. It may well be released on the Lemmy Goes to the Pub label when we're all dead. Later on that summer, I made an appearance on this horrible TV show called Club X. The segment we did was great, though. It was all about black leather jackets, and I wrote a song for it, which was named, cryptically enough, Black Leather Jacket. We whipped out a scratch recording of the song for playback on the show. I played bass on the tape, but on camera, I played piano. The sax player we had laid down 3 tracks, so he brought in 2 of his friends to mime the other parts. Phil Campbell was on guitar, Filthy was on drums, and Fast Eddie was on my bass, which was stolen the night of the filming. I never did find out who took it, although there were several leading suspects. Aren't there always? I also played on a Nina Hagen record sometime around here. I had met her at a festival, and I've always liked her. She's a crazy woman, just great, besides which she's very pretty. Anyhow, she asked me to play on her record, and I didn't happen to be doing anything that day, so I said yes. I had appeared on a lot of different people's albums. I have some free time. Why not? Motorhead was also spending time in the studio working up songs for a new record. It was at that studio that I found Wurzel feeding his dog with a spoon. I walked downstairs one day and there he was on his hands and knees. "What are you doing, Wurz?" I asked. "She's upset," he said. "She thinks I'm leaving her." "Why would she think that?" "She saw me packing my case." "Wurzel," I said, "dogs don't have the concept of suitcase. They don't know about packing clothes for trips. Dogs don't wear clothes." "Well, she thinks I'm leaving." There was no talking to him. He called her Toots because she had a white line up her nose, and she taught Wurzel to fetch sticks. He'd go outside with the dog, and we'd sit and watch them. He'd throw a stick, and the dog would look at him until finally he'd go and get the stick and throw it again. Actually, that dog was pretty smart. Anyway, when we weren't watching Toots teaching Wurzel tricks, we recorded demos of No Voices in the Sky, Going to Brazil, and Shut You Down. These all ended up on 1916, but by then we knew that whatever we did for a new album, it wasn't going to be on GWR. We'd been very wary of Doug Smith for the past year or so. Our attorney, Alex Grower, was looking closely at him around this time, and it became clear that Doug and his wife Eve were not people who had the band's best interests at heart. So we spent several months extricating ourselves from Douglas's management and finding someone new. Wurzel brought this guy, Phil Carson, round to my house one day, and we took him on as a manager for the next couple of years. He used to be involved, if that's the word I want, with Peter Grant and Led Zeppelin, and he managed Robert Plant for a while after that. Phil's barmy like me, but with more string and or discipline, as we say in the trade. I really liked him, and still do. Phil would get us signed to Sony after 15 years, Motorhead's first truly major American record deal. We went quite far with that, not anywhere far enough. What else is new? But that story's for another chapter. In fact, it's the one coming up next. Well, that's the end of Chapter 10. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 10 in the comments below. Before I go, I want to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon, Matt and Stacy from Canada. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.